Hi people, it's been a while. Again, I'm sorry I've not posted much recently. I've been super busy with work, job hunting, just generally trying to stay alive, but I have also been working on something somewhat secretly for a little while now, and that is the comic I'm making. The comic is called Gawaine's Green Knight, and it's based heavily on the Arthurian legend by the very similar name of Sir Gawaine the Green Knight. It's one of the early poems. And look, I get it, Gawaine's Green Knight is not the most inventive title in the world, but if it works, it works. If by some miracle you've been hanging around this channel for a couple of years, then this may not be the first time you've seen me make a similar announcement. I've had a great love for Arthurian legend and the Knights of the Round Table since I was probably about 12 or something. I started with Gerald Morris's The Squire's Tales and then branched out to all the source material, the poems, the legends that inspired those books, and I kind of basically just never stopped being obsessed with it. I have an Aubrey Beardsley illustrated copy of Mallory's Morte d'Arthur that my dad found in a charity shop years ago before I even discovered any of this stuff, and it's honestly one of my most prized possessions. I think I just find the evolution of stories as they're told and retold over the ages to be so fascinating. How do we go from a collection of poems to something like Mallory's work to something like BBC Merlin, which has basically nothing in common with any of the source material anymore? And how do each of those versions and the people who create them pick and choose what details they want to keep in, what they want to leave out, how they want the characters to evolve? Needless to say, I was desperate to try my own hand at it and make my own retelling, so way back in 2020, when I was busy rediscovering my love of art during lockdown, I started developing my own King Arthur retelling, a comic that later came to be known as Knights or Fools, which has a much better title in my opinion, and that focused mainly on the prose Tristan and the fall of Arthur's kingdom, although I was also drawing in elements from other tales such as La Cote Martel and Guinevere and Lancelot's early romance, and I just really wanted to explore the legends through the eyes of a character like, for instance, Sir Dinadan, who became my main character, who are kind of only side characters in earlier retellings, and yet somehow Dinadan is friends with all of the major players, and I wanted to kind of explore how those events would affect him as he watched all of his friends kind of just self-destruct under the weight of their own hubris and the expectations of chivalry and courtly love within those stories. It was an epic tale that I predicted at the time was probably going to take me 7 years to finish drawing, and that was if I worked on it both days every single weekend. So perhaps it was a little bit ambitious for a first comic project, but that sort of thinking has never really stopped me with anything. Now, if you haven't seen or heard of this comic, that's totally fine, I'm not surprised. I started posting it in 2022, right after I'd dropped out of my maths degree, switched to an art foundation year, which I just finished, and then was about to start my animation degree. Needless to say, I was incredibly busy, I was quite overwhelmed with all of the massive life changes that I kept kind of jumping into, and finding enough time to work on the comic was becoming increasingly difficult. I did have a 3-chapter buffer that I'd drawn ahead of the first upload, designed to give me some kind of slack on a posting schedule because I'd have 3 chapters done in advance at all times. But I ultimately caught up with that as well, and then had no buffer. Which might have been okay. I actually managed to stick it out and keep vaguely on top of things and creating the pages and posting until I reached the end of what I was calling Act 1 of 5. Which was as far as I'd originally scripted. I had the rest of the story plotted out, of course. In fact, I had a massive A2 sheet of paper that I'd scrawled all over both sides of, which I still have somewhere, I think. But I hadn't scripted the details of the rest of the series, I hadn't done all the dialogue, and as I tried to drum up the motivation to keep working on the series and continuing it when I reached the end of Act 1, I came to the realization that I'd kind of written myself into a few corners. The relationship dynamics between a lot of the characters felt off, they weren't quite where I wanted them to be, and eventually I came to the decision that I really needed to just scrap it and start over from scratch. This was after a year of posting the comic, not including the previous year spent developing the world and the characters, and so it was kind of disappointing to get rid of all my progress, but it felt kind of necessary. For anyone who did read that comic, or just thinks that it sounds like an interesting story, you can be reassured to know that I haven't abandoned it. I am still working on rewriting it, and the essential vibes and point of the story haven't changed much, although I have now added in a big exploration of asexuality and aromanticism within the context of courtly romance, which wasn't really as present before, but, you know, as you grow and develop, so do your stories. But I want to do it right. This comic has been very important to me for a very long time, like 6 years now, And so it's probably going to be a while before that one is ready to even begin being drawn, let alone posted. But this comic that I'm talking about and announcing in this video is not Knights or Falls. So what is it? Before I started posting Knights or Falls back in 2021, the film The Green Knight, starring Dev Patel, was released. And I want to preface this by saying it's an objectively good film. The cinematography and imagery is stunning, and it's a good tale in its own right. However, when reading the original Gawaine and the Green Knight poem, I have always found that part of what makes it so powerful and such a compelling story is that Gawaine genuinely is trying his very best to be the perfect and most honourable knight. When, over the course of the story, it becomes evident that Gawaine keeping his honour means accepting his death, this genuinely becomes quite a fraught decision for him, because as much as he wants to live, he values his honour so highly that he has to debate whether it is or is not worth his own life. So when I read an interview with the director of the Green Knight film, in which he discussed making Gawaine a more morally grey character because he didn't think paragon heroes, perfect kind of Captain America types, were interesting enough, well, I kind of took that personally. I was still doing my art foundation at the time, and I needed ideas for my final project. So I figured I'd make a short illustrated book with my own version of this tale. I already had some character designs for Gawaine and his siblings, because whilst they weren't key characters in Knights or Falls, they did have a few appearances, and so I was able to adapt these and use them to make this new story. As a hand-drawn uni project, I didn't have a lot of time to really dig into the meat of the story, though, so the book is more succinct than I would have liked, and didn't really get to explore the themes in the depth that I wanted. When that was finished, I obviously moved on to Knights or Falls for another year or so, I went off to university, and then eventually that obviously hit its dead end. And I was so busy trying to just finish my animation degree because, the jokes about animators staying up till 2 in the morning are not entirely exaggerated, that I didn't really consider making another comic at all for a few years. Until last summer, just before I graduated, when I decided I wanted to take another crack at it, and figured that Gawaine's story could be a really good place to start. Ultimately, the Green Knight story is pretty self-contained to the events within it. There's not a lot of links to things that are going on outside of it, so it wasn't going to turn into a massive epic. And whilst it's not what you'd call short-form content, it's much shorter than the ridiculously long tale that I was planning to write before. I also figured it could be a fun way to explore some of the characters who won't get as much attention in the main story, and get some practice with the world building without committing myself to a project that might genuinely take me the next decade to finish. I wrote the entirety of the script up last summer, and whilst I might still edit or change a few things, I'm generally pretty happy with how it's turned out. I'm really hoping that this time having finished the script in advance will help my commitment to the project and make it easier to keep working on it. I'm also just really excited about this story. My version of the tale is obviously going to be more focused on Gawaine and his hero complex, how the high standards he sets for himself lead to his decisions throughout the story, but I also really wanted to explore how that commitment to heroism affects those around him, in particular his younger siblings. Because I don't know about you, but I'd be pretty miffed if my brother told me he'd agreed to a certain death by meeting with an otherworldly creature, regardless of how heroic he thought he was being by doing it. Plus, being able to write a story with a bunch of trans characters is very cathartic right now. The transness of any of these characters is not at all relevant to the plot, which is why I haven't mentioned it until now, but it is there. I do have one confession, though. This time, I don't have much of a buffer. I was very much trying to build one before I started posting, with the idea that I have a few chapters done, and the chapters are going to be longer this time as well. But over the last week or so, I've been making a completely unrelated effort to improve my background art. Backgrounds are something I've always found kind of difficult, and recently I decided that just because I find them hard isn't really an excuse not to do them. I'm hoping to eventually make it as a storyboard artist in the animation industry, so decent backgrounds and good perspective are kind of an essential. The problem is I've started improving too fast, I think. Looking back on the comic pages I've already completed, I'm less and less happy with the quality of the work. Naturally, indie comic artists improve over the course of the story, your art gets better the more you draw, and so it's perfectly reasonable for the first few pages to be a lower quality. In fact, it's kind of essential if you don't want to be continuously restarting the bloody thing, which I don't. But my self-confidence is what I would call sketchy at the best of times, and so I figured I'd be better off starting to upload the comic now, so that as the pages go up, they feel like they're in line with my current standard of work, rather than being a year out of date, which admittedly some of the ones I'm going to be posting over the next few weeks already are a year out of date. That way, once they're posted, I've committed to them, and I can move on to working on the rest of the story without worrying about whether or not I should go back and fix things, whether I should go back and improve them. They'll just be out there. It'll also hopefully mean that I can start seeing what people think of the story sooner and get some feedback, some encouragement on it. You know, there's something about getting comments and feedback that really does motivate the creative process, even though it's important to remember to not entirely tie your self-worth to numbers in an algorithm or anything. Naturally, making this comic is not my full-time job, and my time and resources are limited, so this does mean that uploads are probably going to be slow and potentially a little inconsistent at times because I don't have that buffer. But honestly, I'm not doing all this because I want to build a massive fan base or make a living off my comic. Don't get me wrong, that would be fantastic, but it's incredibly unlikely, and like I said, this is a short comic, so even if I was able to do it full-time, it wouldn't take me forever, and then I would have to find a new job, which, requires me to continue to develop my skills, my portfolio, etc. What I want is to tell my stories, and so if that takes a while, I'm perfectly content with that. That said, I do really hope you'll come along for the ride and the journey with me. The entire prologue of the comic is now currently available to read on Webtoon, and if for whatever reason you don't like that platform, I'm also planning on uploading 2 pages every week to both Tumblr and Instagram, until I reach the end of the prologue. Beyond that, I think I'd like to try and complete entire chapters and then upload them in a similar manner. So, 2 pages a week on social media and put the entire thing on Webtoon at once. That way each chapter will release in one go and release consistently for the length and duration of the chapter, even if it means that there are more intervals and longer intervals between each chapter. I hope it'll keep the story a bit more concise and keep it moving. I am hoping that starting to post it will help with my commitment and my motivation to continually work on the comic and to produce pages, and hopefully I will be able to keep some kind of schedule, but I just can't make any promises right now. I do 100% intend to finish it, though. And either way, I'm just super excited to be able to finally share this with you all, and I can't really wait to see what you all think of it. I would be so happy to chat more about this project. If anyone has any questions, I could quite literally yap about it for days, so feel free to leave any questions, queries, just generally chatting about the Arthurian literature in the comments. I will be super excited. But for now, thank you all so much for watching this video. If you read the comic, thank you for doing that, and I will see you all later. Bye!